Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. Now, as we're all only too well aware, we're living in extremely interesting times with the coronavirus disrupting our normal patterns. As ever in times of disruption, interesting things happen. And one of the things I'm looking at doing with this podcast is exploring those that relate to human behaviour. So I'm always on the lookout for things that are slightly unusual, that can firstly help distract us, but secondly give us some useful insights from a human risk perspective. On this episode, I speak to Alix Hope. Alix is a creative strategist at a design company called Bompas Parr. I first came across them a number of years ago when I heard about the amazing events they put on. Now, Bompas Parr specialise in design around food and drink, brand consultancy and organising immersive experiences. And when I say immersive experiences, these are things like alcoholic architecture, an inhabitable cloud of gin and tonic that you could literally walk through, and a multi-sensory New Year's Eve fireworks in London. It's amazing stuff. So when I read this week that they'd launched a report called Fluid Landscapes, which explores behaviour change and creative concepts in a global pandemic, I wanted to know more. Because obviously if you're a design agency that specialises in giving people immersive experiences, these are really interesting times and you're going to have to think about what it means for your business. And I wasn't disappointed. Fluid Landscapes is fascinating and looks at the challenges we're all experiencing in our daily lives and poses a number of questions about what that means for our relationship with food, our senses and each other. It's a natural subject for the podcast, so I was delighted when Alix, the author of the report, agreed to come on. I'm releasing this on Saturday the 4th of April, so if you're listening to this in the first few days after release, do be aware there's a virtual launch event for the report taking place on Wednesday the 8th of April at 4 p.m. UK time. You'll find details on the Bompass Parr Instagram page. That's BOMPASANDPARR. And if you've missed that, then you can read the report by going to bompassandparr.com. Links to both of those are in the show notes. Not only is the report fascinating, but what Alix has to share about the ideas behind it is extremely thought-provoking. I hope it has the same effect on you as it did for me. Perfect listening then for all of us as we adapt to our changing world. Alix Hope, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having us on.
It's an absolute pleasure. And look, as I explained in my intro, I think you fulfill a really interesting niche in the food world. And I wanted to start by talking about you and about the company you work for. So can you give my audience a little bit around your background and then what it is you guys do?
Of course, happy to. So my role, I'm a creative strategist working at Bompas Parr. You may or may not have heard of the agency, but essentially Bompas Parr are really an incredible agency who work in the sort of, multi-sensory world. So we've done work kind of all across the world. And we've got a multidisciplinary studio consisting of a team of creatives, designers, we've got cooks, specialised technicians, producers and filmmakers. And we're all about kind of bringing, amazing kind of immersive and eventful experiences to the consumer of today. And my role is largely around looking at consumer trends. I look at culture. And it's really about distilling all that research into what's happening around the world in order to influence what's going on and what we can deliver as a creative output. So
this is really experiences based around food. And I've been to a number of your things. There was the room that was kind of filled with gin and tonic. So not literally liquid, but in gaseous form where you walked in and kind of was sniffing in the gin. I've been on a kind of boating lake that was put on top of a department store in London, which was designed around a product launch. So a whole load of sort of sensory experiences. And really what you're doing, if I've sort of understood it right, is to sort of take the idea of food away from just a utilitarian eating into a kind of broader experience to kind of see where you can take that. And you seem to take things to incredible extremities. With sort of small ideas become big. And what I love about it is there's a playful nature to it. which is almost like some small children have been unleashed on food ideas and what can you do with it. Is that sort of fair?
Yeah, exactly. And, I think we kind of see food and drink as our creative platform. We do other projects which have no involvement in food whatsoever, but food and drink is such an exciting a space to play in. I think you were referring to our alcoholic architecture project there, where people could walk through this cloud of gin. And it's a lot of what we do is really about opening people's eyes to things that they've never seen before. And an element of risk is actually what we try and put in a lot of our projects. So it's all about taking an audience on this sensory journey through varying experiences where they kind of end up going through this risk element. And it's all about that suspense and what's going to happen next. So it's great to be on a podcast talking about human risk.
So you're kind of pushing the limits of the imagination. And I'm guessing you very quickly, there's clearly health and safety is a critical piece, because you can't just be allowed to, I don't know, pump gin into a room without there's some thoughts around that. How do you sort of understand the limitations of what's feasible? I mean, there's what's practically feasible, but then sort of in terms of health and safety and other limits to that.
Exactly. So the studio, the way we're split is we have those of us that are kind of coming up with these wild creative concepts, and we have an amazing events team who are there to kind of go into the logistics, the health and safety. And they're the ones, I guess, who are, you could say they're on our backs, sort of saying, let's make sure that everything that we're doing is going to comply with kind of health and safety. But we're always there. We're always trying to push boundaries. We're always talking with our clients, with the spaces even that we are putting experiences in, to ensure that we are pushing those spaces to their limits. And quite often, one of the things that we do when we're developing a new project is we're always trying to create a world first. We're always trying to bring new things to people to ensure that the thing that person is experiencing, they've never experienced it before. And of course, with that comes that kind of element of surprise. Everything that we do, we're trying to ensure that we're educating as well as inspiring people. So that's really at the heart of what we do is education and entertainment.
And I love it because the phrase "do not try this at home" often comes to mind when I see what you guys do, because it's, it really is, as you say, pushing things to the limit. And as we look at what's going on at the moment, and one of the main reasons I wanted to get you on the podcast, apart from the fact that I love what you guys do and I'm curious to find out more, is this report that you've just released called Fluid Landscapes. And I'm guessing that the genesis of that is it is very difficult in the current environment to put on events for obvious reasons. And so how do you find a creative outlet? Is that how this came about?
Exactly. And so, as I said, a lot of my job at Bompass Parr is looking at the way people behave, consumer insights, cultural shifts and trends. And, unfortunately, the world is going through a huge shift at the moment, which is really going to impact the way people think, the way people engage with brands. And so as a studio, we sort of thought, right, well, a lot of what we do is it's multi-sensory experiences that really engage people in new ways. So when you then find yourself in a position of a world where you're being told not to touch surfaces, to remain 2 meters apart from anyone that's around you, apart from those that are in your household, it really got us thinking, what happens next? So we ended up throwing out some questions to the people that are in our studio, who are really amazing thinkers. And when you ask our studio a question, you tend to get an amazing array of answers. We've got people from varying different backgrounds with really hugely varying interests. But we asked people 2 things, and we said, what's going to happen in a mid-coronavirus world, so in the sort of imminent future, and what's going to happen in a post-coronavirus world. So whenever this pandemic ceases, what kind of effect are we going to be carrying forward, and how is that going to influence our creative output?
So it's really just sort of trying to, I guess, from a perspective of your business, point one is sort of how do you get handle on the dynamics that are there, and what does that mean for that? But it's also, I think, you raise some really interesting societal points. So, there's in there you talk about a hand sanitizer sommelier as a really interesting kind of twist on something. We recognize both dynamics, but putting the two together is interesting. What's the sort of broad thrust of thought process? I mean, how do you come up with these pieces? Is it literally just we clear our minds and we see what comes up, or are you looking to anchor things in experiences people recognize from the now and the past?
So it's a huge mix. It's a lot of this comes from the wealth of experience that we have. Bompas Parr have been putting on experiences for, I think, around 15 years. So we're very much experienced in tapping into what people want and what we believe people are going to want. But also, as I've said, we are a creative studio. We almost see ourselves as artists. So we're always looking at things from completely different perspectives. And I think with all the sort of obviously natural negativity around the pandemic, it got us thinking, well, let's look at this in a positive light. Let's try and bring some joy to people by thinking about how these behaviour changing situations are going to have an impact on the world. So things like the sanitizer sommelier, this was an idea where we were looking at, we're all having to use hand sanitizer every day. I think we've all got raw hands now from using so much hand sanitizer.
And if you haven't, listeners, you should have.
Exactly. And it's one of those things where we thought, well, okay, this is something that's being built into our everyday life. So what does that mean for the future? And we're sort of seeing varying different brands produce their own hand sanitizer. So you've got LVMH, who have turned their production lines to hand sanitizer. I think I've seen Brewdog, they've been producing hand sanitizer. So you then start to come up with this new problem, which is, well, what hand sanitizer do I use? Which is, I don't think is something that any of us would have thought we'd be thinking a few months ago. So if you start to look at that from a creative perspective, we thought, well, hang on a minute, what about a sanitizer sommelier? Someone who is the expert on hand sanitizer, who can tell you what the best sanitizer is for your skin, and also is there to call out bad science. So looking at ensuring that what you're being told to put on your skin is based on science, but also has that kind of lovely, cultural twist of being a world-first expert on the varying brand and qualities of hand sanitizer, being this kind of connoisseur of tasting notes like a fine wine.
And that's a fascinating example of two things, I guess, to my mind. I mean, one is we've had an example, I think it's in California, obviously, of a water sommelier, which is sort of not something you would ever. I mean, wine makes sense because they're different. Water, one tends not to think about in that context, but actually, you don't have to have much experience of different mineral waters to recognize there is a shift. And you've kind of pushed that to a logical extremity again, where I don't think if you asked anybody to blind test hand sanitizer, I don't mean taste them, I mean just blind test in terms of the experience, you probably wouldn't have a clue. And so there's an interesting sort of extremity extension of that. And then the second bit I find fascinating is this idea of turning something that is sort of a requirement stroke compliance thing, health requirement into something that's a joyous experience. And so you're turning a sort of a must into a like and into a joyous experience. And that I think is a really interesting shift, because when I think about a lot of the other things that I've seen you do, they tend to start with joy. I think most people, when they think of gin and tonic, for example, that's a pleasurable experience. And so this is interesting, sort of making a virtue out of necessity, if you like.
Exactly. One of the things that we really like to do is ensure that we are raising smiles. We are kind of making people look at things from a different perspective. And that's one of the things that this report was all about. As I said before, there's a lot of negativity in the world at the moment, but I think, there's this sort of doom and gloom element where people are thinking that the world is just coming to a stop. It's coming to a halt. But with this report, we're really hoping that people can look at things from a different perspective. We've had to look, I guess, over the last week, over the last month even, we're having these, I guess, moments of compulsory behavioural change. So within the report, we're looking at things like, we're having to wash our hands for 20 seconds. We can't gather in crowds. We're being told, don't touch your face. And we can't do the regular things on a Friday night that we once would have done, such as go to the pub, go to the cinema, go out to a restaurant. And all those behaviour changes are really turning us into a different person. There's been studies showing that it takes, I think, between 21 and 66 days to form a new habit. So we're at the moment, I think, in the middle of, I think we've done 2 weeks now of our kind of stay at home campaign. And at the end of next week, we'll reach that kind of 21 days of being told to stay at home, which is enough time for this behaviour change to really come to fruition. So with those behaviour changes in mind, as people that are looking at how best to get joy into other people's lives and how best to put these smiles on people's faces, it's all about ensuring that we're just having to look at that from a very different perspective. So when you're looking at a set of potential visitors, of potential consumers that have been used to keeping that 2 metre distance, that have been used to not touching their face, what do we then need to do to kind of shift that thinking, shift that, I guess, experience that we've got in mind in order to be in line with these new behaviours that we're going to be seeing in the world?
And I mean, you've really pushed this idea of sort of this, psychology and psychological experience as much as physical experience. And it's something that fascinates me, which is this idea that if changing reality is expensive or difficult or impossible, changing people's perception can be significantly cheaper, significantly easier, and possibly even more powerful. And so in your report, you cite there's a Heston Blumenthal experiment, which was getting people to drink wine. And I think it was thinking about somebody they liked or somebody disliked, and how did that make the wine taste? And it genuinely seems to have had a result that the people felt differently about the wine according to what was going on inside their heads, even though the raw product was the same. And you take that to a sort of logical extremity and say, well, actually, in a world where we can't necessarily get all the foods that we would like in a way that we want, can we, and I'll put it very crudely, mess with people's minds and give them a sensory experience? And that I think that's a sort of a fascinating shift in thinking. I mean, how do you sort of see that dynamic playing out?
So something that we really love doing at the studio is working with scientists and artists, people from all kind of different realms. And the idea that you're talking about there, we called mind tasting, and this actually the actual idea came from our head chef at Bompas Parr, and he was really sort of imagining that at the moment I think we're all struggling. For example, I live in South London, but I'm going to the shops at the moment. There's nothing on the shelves, so my food cupboard is completely limited. I'm getting quite bored of the same foods again and again. And I think we're kind of down to that last tin of tinned tomatoes, and it's starting to get quite boring. And our chef at work, he started to think, well, is there an opportunity here to really dive into people's kind of inner psyche as they eat? And allow them to tap into old memories in order to change their perception of a single piece of food that they're eating. Mind tasting is something that we've looked at previously. We've actually, at the end of last year, we wrote another report called The Future of Food. And within that, we looked at something similar, which was looking at the idea of brain implants and using brain implants to influence the taste that you end up tasting on your tongue. So looking at the receptors, the links between your brain and your tongue, and how a actual implanted device could influence the flavours within a single piece of food. So it's something that we're hugely interested in, is how the mind works and how we can almost bring a sense of magic and science to our projects and what we do. And I think when we're living in this world where things are starting to get a little bit monotonous, having had to stay at home, having had to reach to the back of the same cupboard every day, which is not getting filled with all the delights that...
Strangely, nothing's appearing, right? I keep looking in mine in a vain hope that I've missed something.
Exactly. And I think with us all working from home, those cupboards are, we're using up food a lot quicker than what we were, because we're having to have our lunch at home, we're having dinner, having breakfast from home. So I think here it's just about looking at kind of, can we really expand the mind? Can we really, start to tap into that inner psyche and change flavours? And
look, it occurs to me as you were talking, and I hadn't really thought about this before, that clearly there is a behaviour change around not just the consumption of food, but as you say, the purchasing of it. And there's something interesting around, we've had behavioural science being obviously deployed, sometimes well, sometimes not so well, to persuade us to change our habits. But it seems as though the limits in terms of food purchasing seems to stop at, let's try and avoid panic buying. We haven't yet got to that palate change, that perception change piece. And I think there's something really interesting where if you were to work with retailers on some of this sort of logic, one could reposition and look at the supply chains that are available and change people's perceptions about what they eat and how they eat through some clever uses of some of the things that you're talking about. So it's interesting to me. It's on the one hand, what you've got is very fanciful and imaginative. But actually, from a practical perspective, there are plenty of things that it could do to help support, for example, a supply chain where if you can't get X, let's try and think about how we promote Y as being something interesting and appealing.
Definitely. And I think that's something that we tend to look into. So, a lot of our ideas, they start being, I guess you could say, quite out there. And, we just talked about mind tasting. That's looking at altering people's state of mind as they eat. But as I've said, this is completely grounded on looking at those behaviour shifts that we're all going through right now. So, when you start from a point which is something quite basic, like the fact that, as you just said, going to the shops, that there's nothing there, or having to, queue 2 meters apart. When you're starting with insights like that, you can always bring the idea back round to something very much every day. And that's, I think, why I love what I do. It's we're looking at things to that super extreme level, but I know deep down that we can build these ideas into the everyday.
And the report doesn't just look at sort of the here and now, and you look very much into the future. And so there's a talk as once we have got over this piece, what does the world look like? And I love the sort of the forward thinking pieces that as almost that we're what would a retrospective on this look like, and how does that how do we sort of remember? How do we think about what's happened? Can you talk a little bit around some of the thinking there?
Of course. So looking into the future is something that I absolutely love. It's amazing when you start to think about the impact of coronavirus, and as we've mentioned about these kind of very stringent hygienic rules that we're having to now follow. And once those rules are lifted and we're told, actually, yes, you can go out and interact with people, you can touch your face again without having to panic about having used hand sanitizer before. What happens then to someone's behaviour? So in the report, we start to look at touch as a taboo. We've been told, don't touch your face. In fact, it's actually been believed that we tend to touch our faces around 23 times in an hour. So once we've gone through this, this 3-week, potentially, I don't know how long period of being told to not touch our face, I'd imagine that 23 times in an hour will be dramatically reduced to almost zero. So in a sort of post-coronavirus world, as we call it, what does that do to touch? And some of the ideas that we explore is this idea of a new taboo. So with the touch as a sense being something that feels almost quite naughty and quite it's like, it's something that you haven't been allowed to do, but now
it's almost like public nudity. It has that level of kind of, you shouldn't be doing that.
Exactly. Yeah, it's one of those things where you start to kind of gradually, we can imagine people starting to creep back into it. And one of the things that all of the ideas in this report are, we're going to start realizing them. So they're all creative concepts.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. So, hopefully within the next few months, you'll start to see some of these things really come to life. One of the ideas in here is all around a haptics museum. So this obviously came from the idea of everyone being told, don't touch things, don't do this, don't do that. So we may need to actually rehabilitate people with the art of touch. So we're imagining a museum where people go in and they can almost go on a sensory haptics tour. And this is where you start to build in that element of risk, because touch now becomes the element of risk. So within the museum, it's a museum where you are allowed to touch things, and you're encouraged to, you might drag your hand through a pool of slime or stroke a wall of fur. Now, if you imagine, I think we've had a couple of weeks now of being told to wear gloves, to be very careful when we're out and about. But if you're then told, actually, you're now allowed to go and to touch all of these different items, I think it kind of, it almost is going to give us a sense of fear of, well, if I touch this object, am I going to fall ill? So I really think there's going to be this element of, as I said, rehabilitating people with touch and making people fall in love with the idea that they can touch things again. And it's such a strange thing because, a few weeks ago, everything, I guess, was quite normal. And, we were all aware of the virus, but we weren't having to live by these very strict set of rules. And now we've had to write a report on allowing people to want to be able to touch again, which is, it as horrible as it is, it's just fascinating to see that kind of human behavior change, and how, in the next few months, there is going to be this need to get people to want to go back out into the world and to interact with each other and with objects again.
And I think that's really interesting, because if you look at sort of traditional museums, there's lots of do not touch signs. And we've all seen videos of people doing things they shouldn't, and then they think, ancient artifact to get broken occasionally because people break those rules. So we all sort of know that. And it extends to museum shops as well. It's a sort of, often there's a touch it, you bought it type mentality. Mm. And I think that's really interesting that you're coming back the opposite way and sort of saying, well, we're going to need to reintroduce something that we have all been used to doing. And sort of the only time we ever come into sort of the word touch is always usually associated with don't touch these things. And then that's the extremity of the piece, but normally touching is okay. And then we shift to a world where touching is absolutely not okay, and we're losing some of that connectivity. And you're kind of saying we need to, and I really like that idea of reintroducing something that we think is natural as an unusual experience and an unusual dynamic. And I can imagine, I was sort of thinking, how would this work? I think, for a period of time, one is going to be terrified to touch things. And sort of particularly in the museum that you outlined, you would sort of be sitting there, have they sanitized it since the last person? Is this okay? So there's this forbidden fruit. I mean, forbidden fruit's a great example, I think, from the Bible around stuff you're not allowed to touch. And so I think there's a really interesting idea there around that. And I'm very excited about the fact you're going to make these things real, because I think this is it's an interesting insight for the rest of us, because you've sort of written about it, and we can start to think for ourselves before you evolve these particular pieces. And I'm fascinated by sort of the norms of the food world, because again, as you were talking, I was thinking about, it's really interesting. I go to a restaurant and particularly sort of at the higher end or the more experiential end of the spectrum. So I'm thinking of the sort of Heston Blumenthal experiences. It is very sensual, and yet it comes from a kitchen where some of the hygiene requirements that we're all required to live by are the norm. You don't want your chefs not having washed their hands. They often use gloves and masks to protect. So there's an interesting piece there around the food industry, which is very strong on, elements of it are not clearly, but done properly. There's a very strong sense of some of these restrictions being in place for the creation, and yet total freedom. You want the opposite from your customers. And so both ends of the spectrum are something that the food industry is used to sort of thinking about and delivering. And I think it's intriguing that you're playing with those dynamics in what you're looking at.
Definitely. So one of the things that we're looking at in the future is having, I guess, these two contrasting behaviours. So one of which is this idea of being kind of scared, being a bit afraid to touch, and still living by very clean and sort of sanitized rules. And on the other end of the spectrum, we've got the idea that people are going to really kind of want to unleash that inner kind of messy self on the world again. So having been sort of held back for these few weeks, is it going to be months? I don't know. But wanting to kind of go back out and dive into a kind of chaotic nature of wanting to kind of, have, one of the ideas in the report was refreshed indulgence. So the idea of a sort of filthy kind of all-in food extravaganza with one rule, which is, not using cutlery. So we think that people are going to start to crave to play with their food. Whereas on the other hand, we explore the idea of this kind of continued hygiene. So, we're by the point the coronavirus has hopefully gone, we'll all have learned these new kind of behaviours. So behaviours around sanitisation. I'm sure we'll continue to be using hand sanitizer regularly. We'll be continuing to think before we act. And so one of the things that we're starting to explore is the idea of sanitizer party pieces. So we've all been to parties where there's you go in and there's this centerpiece. It could be, you've got glitter, you've got chandeliers, you've got champagne towers. But in the future, perhaps we're going to see those pieces take on a twist. So they could be there to help people maintain that kind of rigorous hygiene and the hygiene levels that we're all very much used to by them. So some of the ideas that we're exploring and we're starting to prototype is this idea of cleanliness. So imagine, with alcoholic architecture, we explored, a cloud of gin. But what if people could walk through a cloud of hand sanitizer on their way through to a party? So whilst that is something that's acting on, a new behaviour, which is that we all need to be cleaner, we all want to be cleaner, and perhaps we're going to start seeing that kind of turned into something, as we were talking about earlier, that becomes a want rather than a need. So there's definitely, I think, in a post-coronavirus world, we are going to see those two extremes. So that person that's wanting to get back into dirt and get back into that kind of debaucherous nature versus those people that are wanting to remain super clean and super sanitized.
So many sort of you sort of drove my mind to Handmaid's Tale, authoritarian world where we're constantly told what to do, and how do people in that space, how do people find outlets? And I think this is a fascinating piece of sort of shifting, as I say, something we have to do, something we're going to have to get used to doing, into making it more pleasurable, and thereby sort of reinforcing a habit that we sort of begrudgingly accepted because we recognize the dangers of it, making it fun and joyous. And this idea of taking, very, very simple emotions that you're exploring and turning them into joyous experience, I find really fascinating. And I started in my intro to talk about sort of, it's as if small children have run riot, and that was meant as a compliment. Is there a sense of sort of childish playfulness in all of the things that you do? Is that a key starting component, or does that just come as part of the natural process?
It's interesting you say it. I think it's something that I guess it does kind of come naturally to us, and it's, we're here. We've had so much experience over the last sort of decade or so producing experiences, and it's really about taking people almost out of their comfort zone and giving any kind of visitors that we have to any events that we put on the opportunity to explore something new about themselves. And like you said, maybe that is allowing them to sort of unleash their inner child, or maybe it's about, it's about allowing them to experience something new for the first time. But also, what we do is very much grounded in kind of research into history and into science and art. So it's that kind of magical combination of disciplines that really allows us to put on these events that are kind of, they're sometimes shocking, or they're something that you've not quite seen before. So, one of those behaviours could be this kind of childlike response and this playful response.
Looking forward beyond this, I mean, what's your sort of? So you've produced this report. What are you guys up to at the moment? How are you thinking about the world? Clearly, it's very difficult to predict events. How are you handling that uncertainty?
So, like everyone, we're all looking at the next few months with trepidation and thinking, which, as I say, we wrote this report to think about things differently, and as a studio it's certainly given us this optimistic view of what's happening. And I think, following the report, we're hopefully going to allow people to think about the world differently, and allow people to realize that there are things that we can still do to bring joy to people's lives, to raise those smiles. But it's really just about, twisting that way of thinking. So before the kind of the coronavirus pandemic, a lot of my work was around looking at sort of optimism and community and placemaking and bringing people together for human connection. Enter the coronavirus, and sort of the idea of human connection has kind of gone out the window a little. But what we can do, and we know the coronavirus, it's not going to be around forever, so we can start to plan for the future, and we can start to think about these behavior changes that we're kind of going through at the moment, and how that's going to have an effect on whatever we produce for the future.
And I love that, and it just even speaking to you, there's this positive optimism that comes back, which we absolutely need in the current environment, where I think everything is doom and gloom. And there's a sense, I think, that when one looks at what's going on, you can create a kind of world that says this is almost the planet cleansing itself, and so we've got environmental benefits of what's happening. Clearly, some hideous pieces, and I don't want to belittle those at all, but there's some real shifts going on as we adapt new ways of doing things, and we stop. We're not flying anywhere near as much. Clearly, planes are still in the sky, but there's nowhere near the same volume. We're staying at home a lot more. We are stuck with our families for good or for ill, and so I think there's an interesting reset button almost that's been pressed on many dynamics, and as we adjust to that new space. We're in many respects, we're returning to things. So if I look at old-fashioned values are coming back into play. There's a lot more talk around ethics and challenges, a lot more. We're starting to appreciate the flimsiness of supply chains, and we value people that have been historically underpaid because they're the really important, they're the key workers as the rest of us sit at home. And so I think there's an interesting question that you raise in all the things you're exploring around a sort of, a stepping back a little bit and seeing what's important. Do you see, in terms of sort of the food industry and the things that we're consuming, do you see any of those dynamics playing out, that we're kind of going, I don't know, return to comfort food, back to basics?
It's an interesting one. I think in terms of food, as I've said, we're going through this space where we're having to, just take what we can find in our kind of local stores. From my perspective, I think we're seeing a lot of people going back to things like home baking and having more time in the home to kind of make their own creations. And I believe that we're going to enter a sort of new kind of creative realm. In the report, we outline this idea of this kind of golden era for creativity. And I really believe that, whilst we're at home, as things start to become, as I said, a little bit monotonous and slightly a bit boring in a sense, I think people are really going to start to kind of tap into their kind of inner creative self and really start exploring, pushing the boundaries of what they can do with what's in their cupboards. And I think that, in the future, perhaps we're going to be a little bit more careful when we're shopping. So really kind of taking these learnings from the pandemic and thinking, do I really need to be buying X, Y, and Z? And then kind of looking at, in the future, can we be more creative with what we're doing? Can we bring a little joy into our kitchen like we are having to do at the moment to almost provide ourselves with entertainment? So I think, again, for me personally, when it gets to lunch and dinner every day, it's that opportunity to step away from my laptop, from my kind of working environment. And lunch and dinner almost become those kind of those breakups during the day. So those kind of segue points where you get to be, I'm lucky enough that, the work I do, we are in the kind of creative world, but I step into my kitchen and that becomes a very much a creative space. So I think things will change, and I think things will change for the better.
And I think it's fascinating when you talk about meal times. Because we had this era of, families didn't eat together, eating in front of the television, and it's really a return to traditional pleasures and experiences. And I'm really fascinated that I would look at it and say, to my mind, you're sitting on that cusp of creativity and food. And so I would have thought that in some respects, going to the kitchen and thinking about being creative in the kitchen is it could almost be taking your work home. And that you might want to break from that, but actually, it sounds like you're kind of getting inspiration and joy from that as well, and it doesn't feel like a chore to you.
Definitely, and I think it sounds cheesy, but we're kind of all in it together, aren't we? So we're all kind of going through the same thing, and I think at this time it's really important to kind of keep your head above the surface and to remain positive and to try and bring that kind of optimism through the sort of the things that we once would have considered quite mundane. And weirdly, I think, we're all working from home at the moment. And the strange thing is that as soon as I step away from my desk, I'm kind of, it's almost like my house is now divided up into different spaces. So you step away from the desk and automatically I'm kind of out of work mode. And I think we've all had to learn new behaviours in this time. And weirdly, we've had to learn new behaviours within our own homes. Our homes have become our workplace. They've become our entertainment space and our, a space for a number of kind of a range of emotions. And so I think what's going to be really interesting after this pandemic is what happens to our homes afterwards, because as I said, we've almost been kind of dividing our flats, our houses up into different sections, I think, to provide different elements of kind of entertainment or creativity. So it's going to be very interesting to see what happens following that.
I think that's a fascinating observation. I'm reminded of those, I think it was Muji that kind of created for a studio apartment, here's a piece of furniture that can become, a bed becomes, I'm exaggerating only marginally, bed becomes a kitchen, becomes a shower, becomes a toilet, becomes a whatever, and it's all in that kind of confined space and thinking about reusing the same space for different purposes. So I think that's a sort of a lovely image. And I love the fact that you've taken that thought process to a sort of physical environment that we can all recognize and thinking around, well, what's our relationship with our home? That has been absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much. I'll put a link in the show notes to Fluid Landscapes and encourage people to devour that in the way that it's clearly intended. You're also doing, I think, a session next week for people who get to this podcast early where they can hear a little bit more about you. And I think we want to send people to the Bompass Parr Instagram page, which again, I'll put in the show notes. But if people are sort of fascinated by the things that you've been talking about, what's a good entry point for people? What would be books or websites that you might recommend for people to dive in if they want to know a little bit more around the sorts of things that we've talked about?
So I think, as you just said, we're going to be doing a live presentation on fluid landscapes on Wednesday. So come and listen to that. We'll hopefully shine an optimistic light into your lives. Obviously follow the Bompass and Parr Instagram page. But outside of the Bompass and Parr world, I think, we always encourage people to read. I think, we're at a time now where everyone has some time on their hands. So for us, it's all about reading, diving into those books that you've got on your shelves that you might not have picked up for a while.
I always think it's the equivalent of sort of those shrink wrap DVDs and Blu-rays that one bought sometime, or things you downloaded but you haven't got around to listening. Same thing applies to bookshelves. So I think that's a lovely note on which to finish. Alix, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for being a beacon of joy and fun in a world that is absolutely desperately needed for it. Real pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
So that's it for this episode. My huge thanks to Alix for appearing on the show and to you for listening. Now, if you are interested in reading more about fluid landscapes and the launch event, check out Bompass and Parr. That's BOMPASANDPARR.com, and the same thing on Instagram for details of their launch event and to see some of the wonderful imagery from the things that they are involved with. If you're not already subscribed to the Human Risk podcast, you will find this wherever you get your quality audio content. I will be back very soon with another episode of the show, as I've mentioned before, trying to get a few more out to help see us through these challenging times and to explore some of the interesting human risk dynamics. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you so much for listening.